A reactor in eastern China just held something inside it hotter than the core of the sun. Not for a second, not for a flash, for 17 minutes straight. Somewhere in a control room in Hefei, a team of scientists watched a number climb past a threshold that had defeated the best-funded physics programs on Earth for 70 years. And in Washington, the reaction wasn't celebration. It was a much quieter, much more uncomfortable question. How did they get there first? This isn't a story about a bomb or a satellite or a chip. It's about something stranger and, in the long run, more consequential than any of those. A machine designed to trap a piece of the sun on Earth and keep it burning long enough to be useful. For most of the last century, that idea belonged almost entirely to American and European labs. It was the kind of problem that 8 careers, 8 budgets, and 8 decades, always staying just a few years out of reach. Now it doesn't look quite so far away anymore. And the machine that closed the gap isn't in California or France. It is in Anhui province, and it's called EAST. Let's be clear about what EAST actually is, because this isn't fringe science or a state media exaggeration. He Experimental Advanced Superconducting Tokamak is a real fusion research reactor operated by the Institute of Plasma Physics, part of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, based at the Hefei Institutes of Physical Science in Anhui province. It isn't a rumor or a rendering. It's a working machine that's been running experiments since 2006, and it's a formal partner in the ITER project, the massive international fusion collaboration involving the United States, the European Union, Russia, Japan, South Korea, India, and China, all working toward the same long-term goal of commercial fusion power. On January 20th, 2025, EAST's operations team, led by physicist Gong Xianzu, achieved something no fusion reactor on the planet had done before. They sustained a steady-state, high-confinement plasma for 1,066 seconds, at temperatures exceeding 180 million degrees Fahrenheit, more than 6 times hotter than the core of our own sun. That's the real, documented, independently reported anchor of this story. Everything that follows explains why that number matters so much more than it sounds like it should. And the record wasn't a one-off publicity moment either. EAST's own operations team celebrated the result in Hefei W with the kind of understated relief that comes from a genuine, hard-won engineering win rather than a staged photo opportunity. Years of incremental upgrades to the reactor's superconducting magnets, its heating systems, and its plasma control. Software all converging on a single successful run. That's the part outsiders often miss about frontier physics. A record like this isn't the result of one clever idea. It's the accumulated payoff of hundreds of smaller, unglamorous fixes, stacked one on top of another for years, until the machine finally holds together long enough to make history. Here's the everyday version of the problem scientists have been fighting for 70 years. Imagine trying to hold a handful of fire in your bare hands. Not for an instant, but continuously, without it burning you, without it going out, and without you ever actually touching it. And that's roughly what a tokamak has to do with plasma, except instead of ordinary fire, it's holding a gas so hot that its atoms have been ripped apart into a soup of charged particles, hotter than anything found naturally anywhere in the solar system outside a star's core. You can't hold that in a container, because no physical material could survive contact with it. Instead, you have to hold it with something invisible, a cage built, entirely out of magnetic fields, shaped like a hollow donut, squeezing and steering the plasma so it never touches the reactor walls. For decades, scientists could do this for a few seconds at most before the plasma became unstable and collapsed, like trying to balance a spinning top that keeps wobbling itself off the table. The instability doesn't happen gradually. Either plasma that's been perfectly steady for minutes can suddenly develop a ripple in the magnetic field, and within milliseconds, the whole thing collapses, dumping its heat against the reactor wall in what engineers call a disruption. Guarding against that failure mode, second after second, for the better part of 18 minutes straight, is what actually makes EAST's result difficult. It isn't one hard problem solved once, it's thousands of small, continuous corrections, made automatically by control systems reacting faster than any human could, all happening simultaneously to keep the plasma from ever wobbling itself off the table. Now stack a second comparison onto that same number, because 166 seconds deserves it. That's not just 17 minutes of runtime. It's more than 2.5 times longer than EAST's own previous world record. It's the difference between striking a match and keeping a bonfire burning steadily through an entire evening, using nothing but magnets to keep the flame from ever going out. That's the concept. Now here's the part that connects it to why America has spent so long chasing this exact number. The pursuit of controlled nuclear fusion has been running in the United States since the 1950s, when physicists at Princeton first began experimenting with early plasma confinement devices under a program that would eventually become the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. That early American effort ran alongside parallel programs in the Soviet Union, where the tokamak design itself was actually invented. a detail worth including, honestly, since the donut of magnets concept East uses today is a Soviet invention from the 1950s and 60s, refined and scaled up by American, European, Japanese, and eventually Chinese labs over the following decades. Through the Cold War and into the 21st century, American fusion research poured billions of dollars and multiple generations of scientists into machines like Princeton's tokamak fusion test reactor and MIT's Alcador CMOD, a smaller, high-field tokamak that set its own confinement records in the 1990s before being decommissioned in 2016 for budget reasons rather than any scientific failure. That detail matters because it illustrates something specific to the American side of this story. Promising fusion programs have periodically lost funding and been shut down, not because the physics stopped working, but because the political appetite for multi-decade, high-cost science ran out before the payoff arrived. Then there's the National Ignition Facility in California, which uses a completely different approach from East, firing enormous banks of lasers at a fuel pellet instead of magnetically confining plasma inside a donut-shaped chamber. In December 2022, NIF achieved a genuine milestone of its own. For the first time, a fusion reaction produced more energy than the lasers put directly into the fuel, the result researchers called ignition. It made headlines everywhere, and rightly so. It was proof, finally, after decades of trying, that a controlled fusion reaction really could put out more than it took in. But ignition at NEF lasted a fraction of a second, using a single laser pulse on a single tiny target the size of a peppercorn. It proved fusion ignition was physically possible. It did not prove fusion could run continuously, at scale, the way an actual power plant would need it to. And repeating that exact ignition result reliably, shot after shot, has itself turned out to be a difficult, expensive, multi-year engineering project in its own right. That's the part of the puzzle East just moved forward on. Sustained, stable, magnetically confined plasma, held not for a fraction of a second, but for the better part of 18 minutes, is a different and, in some ways, an even harder problem than a single powerful pulse. It's the difference between proving an engine can produce power once and proving it can run all day without stalling out. Two different countries, using two completely different approaches, have now each cracked one half of their same 70-year-old problem. Neither has cracked both halves at once. That's the real state of the race, and it's more interesting than either half sounds on its own. Now here's where the story deepens, because East's 2025 record wasn't a lone data point. It was the latest step in a documented pattern of steady, incremental progress. In 2023, the same reactor set a world record of 403 seconds, a huge jump at the time from anything achieved before it. Song Yuntao, director of the Institute of Plasma Physics, described the 1,066-second result as a critical step toward realizing a genuinely functional fusion reactor, explaining that a real fusion device has to operate stably at high efficiency for thousands of seconds at a stretch to allow the kind of continuous plasma circulation a future power plant would depend on. In other words, the target isn't 17 minutes. The target is closer to running indefinitely, and East's team is climbing toward that target in measurable, repeatable jumps rather than one lucky breakthrough. Quick recap before we go further, because a lot has landed already. Fusion means holding plasma hotter than the sun's core, inside an invisible magnetic cage. America and its research partners have chased stable versions of this for 70 years. NIF proved fusion ignition was possible for a fraction of a second. East just held a stable, high-confinement plasma for over 1,000 seconds, more than double its own previous record, and the longest sustained result any tokamak on the planet had produced up to that point. Now let's get into what happened next, because the story didn't stop there. In January 2026, roughly a year after that endurance record, East's team announced a second different kind of breakthrough. Researchers, including physicist Zhu Ping of Huazhong University of Science and Technology, reported that East had achieved stable plasma operation at electron densities significantly higher than the reactor's previous limits, pushing past a threshold known as the density limit, a boundary that had constrained tokamak performance across the entire field, not just at East. Zhu described the finding as suggesting a practical and scalable pathway for extending density limits in tokamaks, and in the next generation of burning plasma fusion devices being planned worldwide. That distinction matters because duration and density are two separate walls fusion researchers have been pushing against for decades, and East had now made real measured progress against both of them within about a year of each other. To understand why density is its own separate wall, think back to the fire in your hands image from earlier. Duration is about how long you can keep holding the fire without your grip slipping. Density is about how much fire you can pack into the same size hand without it overwhelming your grip in the first place. Push the density too high in a tokamak, and the plasma tends to develop instabilities that dump its heat onto the reactor wall almost, instantly ending the experiment. For years, that density limit was treated as close to a hard physical ceiling. East's January 2026 result showed the reactor holding stable plasma at densities roughly 30 to 65% above its previous operating range, using a specific combination of heating techniques timed early in the plasma's formation. That's not a cosmetic improvement. It's the kind of result that gets folded directly into how engineers design the next generation of larger reactors, including ITER itself. Here's the part that makes this bigger than one lab's achievement. East doesn't operate in isolation. Its results feed directly into ITER, the International Fusion Reactor, currently under construction in southern France, which China is formally participating in alongside the United States, the European Union, and several other nations. Every second of stable plasma East manages to hold, and every density record it pushes past becomes usable engineering knowledge for that much larger, much more expensive international project. So this isn't simply a case of one country racing past another in isolation. It's a case of one participant inside a shared global effort suddenly generating a disproportionate share of the field's actual progress. And that shift in where the breakthroughs are coming from is exactly what's rattling assumptions in Washington. It also isn't just a story about government labs anymore. In the United States, the more recent hope for a faster path to fusion has shifted heavily toward private companies. Firms like Commonwealth Fusion Systems, spun directly out of MIT's fusion research program after Alcator CMOD lost its federal funding, now racing to build a demonstration reactor of its own using high-temperature superconducting magnets. That shift says something important on its own. America's fusion ambitions increasingly depend on venture capital and private timelines, while China's program has been able to lean on sustained, centrally directed state investment through its national research institutes. Running year over year without the funding cliffs that ended programs like Alcator CMOD, neither model has yet produced a working commercial reactor, but they represent two very different bets on how a 70-year problem finally gets solved. One banking on private capital moving fast, the other banking on a state research apparatus that doesn't have to justify its budget to shareholders every quarter. For most of the 20th century, the unspoken assumption in American science policy was that the hardest, most expensive frontier physics problems, the ones requiring decades of patient, expensive, low-glory research, were where the United States held a natural and probably permanent advantage. Fusion was supposed to be one of those problems. Too costly, too slow, too technically brutal for any country to shortcut. China's East results are a direct challenge to that assumption, not because China skipped any of the hard engineering, but because it did the hard engineering faster, with sustained state investment and a research pipeline built specifically to keep hitting successive records rather than one headline moment and a long pause. 2 records in 2 consecutive years, from the same facility, tackling 2 different unsolved problems in the same field. That's not luck. That's a research program operating with a level of continuity that's become genuinely rare in American big science funding. Now here's where the story needs to slow down, because getting this right matters more than making it sound bigger than it is. To be clear, East's 1,066-second record did not stand unchallenged for long, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Less than a month later, in February 2025, France's West Tokamak, based at the CEA's Cataract facility, reported an even longer sustained plasma of 1,336 seconds. Fusion research, genuinely, is a global, collaborative field, not a 2-country race with a single finish line, and records like these are typically broken repeatedly as different reactors incorporate each other's engineering lessons. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts against the simplest version of this headline. If the story were really China beat America and now leads the world, it would need to explain why a French reactor, working within a European research consortium, quietly took the exact same record back within weeks. The more accurate picture is messier and, honestly, more interesting. Fusion progress right now looks less like a single race with one leader and more like several serious national programs trading the lead back and forth, each one borrowing lessons from the other's publicly shared data. It's also important to be precise about what sustained plasma actually proves and what it doesn't. Duration records like East's demonstrate stability and control, the ability to hold plasma steady for a long time without it collapsing. They are not, by themselves, records of net energy production. NEF's 2022 result and East's 2025 result are answering 2 different halves of the same enormous problem. One proved fusion can output more energy than is put directly into the reaction for an instant. The other proved plasma can be held stable for a very long time, without yet proving that stable, long-duration plasma can also produce more energy than it consumes. No reactor on Earth has yet combined both achievements at once, and researchers across every country involved in this field, including scientists in China, are open about how much engineering work remains. before fusion produces commercially usable electricity. There's a further distinction worth making, because it separates real progress from marketing. What East has demonstrated is engineering-level proof, specific magnetic configurations, specific heating techniques, and specific control systems that measurably extend how long and how densely a tokamak can hold plasma. What it has not demonstrated is a commercially viable power plant, a solved materials durability problem for reactor walls exposed to that heat for years at a time, or a proven economic case for fusion electricity actually reaching a household grid. Those remaining problems are not small footnotes. They're arguably harder in some respects than the plasma physics itself, since they involve materials science, supply chains, and cost curves that no single confinement record can settle on its own. The honest version of this story isn't China solved fusion. It's China's national fusion program is now producing some of the most important incremental engineering progress in the entire field, on a timeline that is forcing other countries to recalibrate how much of a lead they actually still have. That recalibration is the real headline underneath the flashy one. It's not about a single reactor. It's about what it means when the country making the fastest measurable progress on one of physics, oldest unsolved problems, is no longer the one that's been working on it the longest. Which brings the story back to that control room in Hefei and the number climbing past a threshold nobody else had reached. 17 minutes doesn't sound like history when you say it out loud, but inside that number is 70 years of failed attempts, billions of dollars spent by multiple countries chasing the same impossible target, and a slow, patient climb from 400 seconds to over 1,000 one incremental engineering fix at a time. Nobody in Hefei claimed they had built a power plant. What they built was proof that the wall standing between humanity and a working fusion reactor is a few centimeters thinner than it was the year before, and that the team chipping away at it fastest right now isn't the one everyone expected. That's really what this story's about, underneath the headline. Not a single machine, and not even a single country. It's about what happens when a problem that took 70 years to even partially crack suddenly starts yielding real progress every 12 months instead of every 12 years, and about which nations are actually built, institutionally and financially, to keep pace with that new rhythm. So here's the question worth sitting with as this race keeps unfolding. Does it actually matter which country's flag is on the reactor that finally cracks fusion power? Or does it only matter that someone does, and soon? Tell me in the comments which fact in this video surprised you more, that East held plasma hotter than the sun's core for over 17 minutes, or that France quietly broke that exact record less than a month later. Either way, the race toward a working fusion reactor isn't slowing down, and the next record is probably already being set somewhere right now.